So both men and women are broken. It's a fact. But we are broken in very different ways. So when I was in college, there was an incident on campus where a girl was taking a shower, and then some random guy came in, jumped into her shower. She screams her head off. The guy runs out the door, and it became like instantly really, really big news. Not that a college guy jumping into some girl's shower is big news, but it's probably hard for you to imagine. If you're under the age of 40, there was a day when on college campuses, the whole campus was just open. Every building. So dorms, you could just walk right in and go visit your friend, and you go check out, hey, what are they doing? And so up to that point, you could just walk into dorms. But because of that one event, because of that one pervert, they locked down the entire campus permanently. And so we're sitting here like, oh man, what just happened? Like our lives are changed, and what happened to this girl? What happened to this situation? This is terrible all around. And so we're sitting in my room with a couple of guys, and we're talking about it. And one of my friends, who's going to remain nameless because I'm still friends with him, says, it's awful what happened to this girl, but doesn't it just show you the difference between guys and girls? And we're like, what do you mean? And he says, in all seriousness, well, a random guy jumps into a girl's shower and it's a total nightmare. We have to lock down the whole school. But if I were taking a shower and a random girl were to jump in, it would be my dream come true. And we're sitting there, we're all like looking at him like, what? He's right. And we're all these college guys, we're like, man, we're imagining a random girl jumping into our shower, and we're like, yeah, I would scream hallelujah. A college guy can hardly imagine something better than a random girl jumping into his shower. Now consider this, though. Consider a girl's brokenness, sexual brokenness, might look like fear of a random guy jumping into her shower, and a guy's sexual brokenness might look like the fantasy of a random girl jumping into a shower. Both are broken. Both are wrong. There's something not right there, but they're broken in very, very different ways. And I'm not here to say that all men are broken in the same way or all women are broken in the same way, because brokenness is like a thumbprint. I mean, there's similar patterns, but each one is unique. So here's my question. What happens when you take two very different, very broken people and you put them together in the marriage bed? What happens when his broken hopes and desires and expectations meet her broken hopes and desires and expectations? What happens when his dreams meet her nightmares? So today we are going to talk about marital sex, or the lack thereof. Our text for today is 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 1 through 7, and we will finally get to discuss sex that God approves. That God says, yes, you should do this, have sex in marriage. But it appears that, right off the bat, when we get to this text, it appears that it's going to be hard to believe for some of you, but some married couples in Corinth aren't having sex. Like, can you imagine living in a world that's completely obsessed with sex and everyone's having sex with everyone and everything until they get married? Shocking, I know. So let's get this out of the way. Singles, I'm glad you're here. You get next week. For this week, I know what you're thinking. Like, I was there once. And so you guys, you're thinking about marriage right now, and you're like, oh man, it's going to be so great. Someday we're going to get married, and 4, 5, 6 times a week I'm going to come home, and my wife's going to be standing there in nothing but an Eagles jersey. And we are going to have wild sex, and then we're going to fall asleep watching ESPN. And I am here to tell you that's exactly what marriage is like. Just get ready. Except for you young women, you know that all the other guys are like that, but not your guy. Your guy is special. He's sweet. He's not one of these perverts. Your guy, 4, 5, 6 times a week, he's going to surprise you, and every time it'll be different. And one of the days, it'll be something like a single rose with a note on it that just appears on your desk, and it'll say, put on that dress. I'm taking you out. And that night, he's going to sit and he's going to stare in your eyes and ask you so many questions about your past and who you are and how you're feeling. And then that night, you're going to fall asleep spooning together, because that's what my marriage is like. So this is how we think. And then reality slaps us in the face. Right? You have work, stress, babies, bodily functions, sprinkle in an occasional fight, misunderstanding, and about 10 years into your marriage, you're like pulling out your phone, you're like, you got to schedule sex like a doctor's appointment. Like, I think I have time Tuesday after next. Like, it's just, sex, if we're not careful, becomes a casualty or worse. So, 1 Corinthians chapter 7, starting in verse 1. Let's read this. Now for the matters you wrote about. This is how it starts out. Now for the matters you wrote about. Just to be painfully clear here, he's talking about the matters they wrote about. Which is to say, they wrote about a specific matter. And if we want to understand what the rest of this text says, we need to have at least some idea what that specific matter was about. Get it? All right? Same page? And he says, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. Now, if I'm going to lose you, it's going to be in the next few minutes. And this message day, if I'm going to lose you, it's going to be in the next few minutes. And I want you to know, the stakes are really, really high here. How we interpret that little phrase is going to affect how we interpret the whole rest of the passage, and is going to basically affect your sex life for the rest of your life. The stakes are high, friends. Pay attention. So there's two vastly different ways of interpreting this that lead to two vastly different interpretations. And the first is this, is that the traditional view is that this is a statement that the Apostle Paul is writing to the Corinthians. This is his statement. It is good for a man to not have sexual relations with a woman, period. Full stop. Marriage is a concession. And then if we read it that way, what we're going to see is the rest of the passage is then about, you know what, but you guys are such perverts and there's so much stuff going on out there. I guess if you just can't control yourselves, I guess you should get married then. View number one. Now, to be fair to this view, it has a long, long history. Christians have a long, long history of viewing sex and marriage as a concession or second best to virginity, celibacy. So let me just review some of this for you. First century, almost as early as the New Testament, there's a book called the Acts of Paul and Thecla, a fiction book, but it kind of describes a Christian theme. And it's Paul and Thecla, and in that, Paul lists a list of beatitudes, like Jesus on the Sermon on the Mount, and 3 or 4 of his beatitudes are on virginity. Virginity is the highest virtue. First century, this is coming out. Second century, this pretty man here, Clement of Alexandria. Clement is famous for his prohibition of afternoon delight. You know what I'm talking about? He said, thou shalt not have sex during the day, period. So the entire region under his leadership had to ban sex during the day. His student, Origen, took this one step further. Not only was he celibate and say no sex during the day, he then castrated himself. Yes. 1 century later, Jerome, overall a good guy, but he ferociously argued that Mary, the mother of God, had to be a perpetual virgin. Despite all evidence, despite common sense, and not only that, he argued that Joseph had to be a virgin as well. All right? Augustine, similar time period, was a sex addict turned saint, and he went on to say that to link sex, the sexual act, with original sin, and therefore sex was a duty for procreation only. Christians should not enjoy sex. They should do their duty. By the mid-12th century, this is a church calendar from that time period, we find that the church really clamps down on it, and beginning in the 12th century, priests were no longer allowed to marry. That's when that came in, 12th century. Marital status must be controlled by the church. which they did by officially prohibiting sex before and after any major church holidays. Here's the thing. There are about 30 major church holidays. So if you do the math, let me read this quote to you. This is from Mary Ann McPherson Oliver in her book, Conjugal Spirituality. She says, if you count it up, there would have been 83 days remaining in the year when, provided, of course, the woman did not happen to be menstruating or pregnant, and provided that they intended procreation, 83 days couples could, with the permission of the church, have indulged in, but not enjoyed, sexual intercourse. Okay, so that's one possible reading of it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. Of course, the problem with this view is the Bible. That little thing. So I won't rehearse all the stuff we've covered for the last few weeks, but just going back to Genesis 1 and 2, it seems to suggest just the opposite of that. It seems to suggest it is good. It is good for a man to have sexual relations with a woman. Adam and Eve, God blesses it, calls it good, calls it holy. And then there's the whole matter, of course, that really is unavoidable. Right in the middle of our scriptures is Song of Solomon. This is a collection of erotic poems between a lover and his beloved. And there's like this chorus singing to them like, woo, it's going to be a great night. Like in the middle of our Bible, God decided to put erotic poems in the center of his holy word. Have you ever read this book? So chapter 7 is the most famous, right? The lover looks at his beloved and he goes from her feet to her head, and she is just out there. He says, how beautiful are your feet. Your graceful legs are like jewels. Your navel is around a goblet that never lacks blended wine. Like I want to drink you like a glass of Chardonnay. Your waist is a mound of wheat. Never say that, men. And then he goes over her breasts. They're like two fawns of a gazelle. Your neck, your eyes, your nose is like the Tower of Lebanon. I don't know whether. Your head, this is my favorite. Your hair is, use this one, man. Your hair is like royal tapestry. The king is held captive by its tresses. Isn't that good? Isn't that good? And then he steps back after all of this, and he takes a look at her naked in her glory, and he says, how beautiful you are and how pleasing, my love, with your delights. Your stature is like that of the palm and your breasts like clusters of fruit. I said, I will climb the palm tree and take hold of its fruit. Amen. Let's close in prayer. Okay, maybe not quite. Okay. Okay, and here's the thing, though. This is, you say, okay, guys have been saying this stuff forever, right? But it's not just the guy. You read through the book. In chapter 5 of the book, she's like, blow, north wind, come into my garden and taste my choice fruits. And I can tell you what that means, but I'd have to fire myself. So yeah, God thought it would be good for our souls and our bodies to put this in the middle of his holy word. So, if the Apostle Paul is saying that marriage is a concession and you should only have sex if you can't stop sinning, if that's what he's saying, then we have to do something with all the rest of these texts, the rest of the Bible, the rest of Jewish tradition, and our own desires. We have to do something with that, which leads us to the other way to interpret this verse. It is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. This is how this translation takes it. This is how I take it. It takes it as a quote. The Apostle Paul in that says, now about what you wrote to me, you wrote this statement that says it's good for a man not to have relations with a woman. Let's talk about that. And he's going to correct this view, correct it, that's wrong. There might be something there, that there might be some who are called to celibacy, but that is wrong view. Now, as you might guess, I am thoroughly convinced of this view, and not just because I like sex. Virtually every major New Testament scholar of the past 20 years holds this view. It makes better sense of the text itself grammatically. It makes better sense of the historical setting. It matches what the Apostle Paul teaches about marriage. It matches the rest of the Scripture. And it matches all of Jewish tradition leading up to this. So let's paint the scene here. The Apostle Paul is hanging out in Ephesus, just across the way. And he gets this letter from Corinth. And in their letter to him, they write, "It is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman." So some in the church seem to think that sex is bad even in marriage. Some seem to think that true spirituality is asexual, or at very least celibate. That you do away with your gender. When you become a Christian, you put that gender stuff behind you. You put sex behind you. If you're asking, how in the world would they ever come up with this? I want you to remember three things. One, they live in Corinth. Illicit sex is everywhere. It's socially acceptable, and it is explicitly pagan. All over, there are male and female prostitutes who are worshiping pagan gods, idols. So in Corinth, it makes sense that you would look and say, everything I've known of sex has always been evil. So you say, sex must be evil. Number two, I want you to remember that Jesus was celibate. And he did teach that in the resurrection, in eternity with God, there will be no marrying or giving in marriage. We will be, to quote his words, Matthew 22, we will be like the angels in heaven. There will be no marriage, no sex. So you can see, if Jesus was celibate, and someday we will do away with gender and sexuality in some way in heaven. In our resurrection, we will be supra-sexual, meaning we will be beyond our human sexuality. There'll be a different point to it. You can see how people would then say, if I want to be like Jesus, I need to not have sex. And if I want thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, then I need to stop having sex. Then I'll be like it is in heaven. Now, just to be clear on this, though, many people did take it that way. The Apostle Paul specifically addresses this issue in 1 Timothy chapter 4, in which he calls it a demonically inspired lie, by which I take that he means it's not quite right. All right, so they live in Corinth. It's a messed up place. Jesus was celibate, and then the third reason why someone might come up with this is, I want you to remember this from last week, the influence of Greek dualism, specifically the mind-body dualism or the spirit-body dualism. Last week we talked about this, and I want to point out that dualism comes in two flavors. Last week we talked about this. It was like, my body doesn't matter. What really matters is my soul. I've given my heart to Jesus, so I can do whatever I want with my body. So they would go sleep with prostitutes. That's flavor one. Flavor two is this. My body doesn't matter. My soul matters. So I'm going to ignore my body. I'm going to hate my body. I'm going to stop doing what my body demands. I'm only going to do things that feed my soul. Therefore, I'm going to reject sex. Flavor number two, both of which seem to be occurring simultaneously in the church of Corinth. So in the church of Corinth, there specifically what fills out this picture is that we will see Paul refer to, you might remember this from last fall, to those who call themselves spiritual. There's this group of people who say, we're super spiritual. Like, we have great spiritual gifts. We've achieved a higher level of spirituality. We don't need all those fleshly desires the way you do. We don't need things like sex. And so there was a group in the church that came up last fall, is going to come up again in a few months. The issue there is that group was primarily, not entirely, but primarily women. All right? So the spiritual way of thinking among these women comes out a little more clearly when you see that word man and woman, same Greek word can be translated husband and wife. So let's read it this way, because I think this is what Paul means here. He says, you wrote, it is good for a husband not to have sexual relations with a wife. Wah! Yeah, that's what they were saying. Paul's going to beg to differ. Verse 2. But since sexual immorality is occurring, each man should have sexual relations with his own wife, and each woman with her own husband. So just to clarify, in this reading here, where we're seeing this, sexual immorality is occurring. Each husband should have sexual relations with his own wife, and each wife with her own husband. That's what he's saying. Paul is not, here at least, he is not arguing in this that single people should get married to avoid sexual immorality. In this passage, he is arguing that married people should have sex with each other to avoid sexual immorality. Amen? Amen. So, we could close right here, but that is the main point of this text. But it gets a little bit more nuanced than that. If you look at this, there's an author named Gordon Fee, scholar. He points out that the actual translation here in English glosses over something. It literally says, but since sexual immoralities, plural, are occurring, and this is going to be, we're going to get a little bit in the weeds here, so this suggests something. This is a rare use of the plural for immoralities. It just sounds weird, sexual immoralities. It suggests that Paul has something specific in mind. So if he said, since sexual immorality happens, you might think, oh, because we live in a place where there's just lots of sexual immorality everywhere. It's the category of sexual immorality. But he doesn't. He says, since there are sexual immoralities, specific ones occurring, you need to have sex with one another. Now, do you see the difference here? I won't get into the grammatical reasons here. I don't want to bore you, but I do want you to see this. This suggests that the specific acts of sexual immorality that he's referring to are actually the ones we just talked about last week. That because of this, since this is going on, namely, men are sleeping with prostitutes. So, if I haven't lost you yet, get the major implication of this minor grammatical detail here. There are a group of spiritual women in the church who've sworn off sex and tell their husbands we're not having sex anymore in the name of Jesus. Now there's a whole group of husbands who are forced into celibacy while living in Corinth, the sex capital of the world. And so what's happening here, when you put this whole picture together, is one by one, these dudes are dropping like flies. They start to buckle and start going to prostitutes. It is a complete and utter mess. The husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. Paul speaks so poetically here. Do your duty. You got a duty to do. In fact, if you literally translate it, it says there's a payment that's due. So literally, husband should pay what he owes to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. It's the sense that husbands owe their wives sex, and their wives owe them sex, and they both need to start ponying up. How romantic. Don't use that line at home, by the way. You need to pony up. Not an application point. So if you're thinking, that's disgusting, Paul, why are you talking about marital duty and ponying up? I thought marriage was supposed to be beautiful and romantic and intimate and loving. So I want to just set this context. Why is Paul using this language? Because it's for a particular reason here. He's not just pulling this out for any reason. Why is he saying, you need to pony up, you need to do your duty? Why is he saying it that way? All right, so two things. Number one, this is set in he's building off of an ancient rabbinic tradition. So based on Exodus chapter 21, verse 10, rabbis took the low bar for marriage was this. If you're married, you have to provide your spouse with food, shelter, and sex. Low bar here. But you don't do those three things, and you're failing. You're technically failing according to the Jewish tradition. So as soon as Paul references their marital duty, I want you to see the context here. He's not trying to paint the picture of what marriage could be. He does that in Ephesians 5. Here, he's talking about, when he talks about your marital duty, he's talking about the basic minimum requirements. All right, if you're going to be married, you've got to do at least those three things. And he says, of course it's not ideal. Of course it's not romantic. And that's the point. If you're not providing food, shelter, and sex, your marriage is failing. Number two, so the first thing is, the reason why Paul uses this language is to suggest that he's building off, this is the low bar. This is building off ancient rabbinic tradition. And number two, I want to just point out that at times, sex is a duty. So here's the situation. Women have sworn off sex, and their husbands are visiting prostitutes. In today's terms, let's bring this up. Women have pushed their husbands away, and men are looking at porn. Well, so women, I want you to imagine this. Imagine your husband has been cheating on you, or at least looking at porn. You've been in Bible studies and prayer groups, and he is up looking at porn late at night. All right? Imagine that. You find this. Now, knowing that, after you know this about your husband, would it be helpful to appeal to your deep feelings of love and respect for him in that moment? Probably not. If you are ever going to sleep with that man again, it probably has to be about something other than how you feel about him. Now, men, imagine your wife has shut you off sexually and then acted like she's better than you spiritually. Imagine that she's done this for long periods of times, and you feel so denied that you break and you go out and do something shameful, and now she knows about it, and what's worse, she will never let you forget about it. With every look, every comment, everything she does, she tells you how unspiritual you are and how much you disgust her. Now, men, would it be helpful to appeal to your deep feelings of love and respect for her? Probably not. The only way you're going to sleep with that woman again has to be about something other than how you feel about her. I want you to see this. This might not sound beautiful or romantic, but I love this passage because this is real. This is pastoral counseling 101. I see this in my office once a week. This is real. Real marriage is messy sinners. It's two very different, very broken people coming together, and it's a struggle, and it's messy. And sometimes sex has to be a duty. Sometimes the only reason you would have sex with that person is because you've swore an oath before God and those witnesses. That at times you have sex not because you want to climb that palm tree, but because it's the right thing to do, and that's the only reason. So this brings me back to that book I mentioned earlier, Gary Thomas, Sacred Marriage. He asked that question, just to repeat it. What if God designed marriage? Oh, let me put this up for you. What if God designed marriage to make us holy more than to make us happy? And his chapter on sex is brilliant. He calls marital sex a spiritual discipline. I think he's on to something here. He says sex, God designed sex with two vastly different people, and he did it on purpose. He made it hard on purpose so that when we come together, we have to learn to love someone, to entrust ourselves to someone who's different than us. That in this process, in short, in sex, we have to learn to submit ourselves wholly to God so that we can submit ourselves wholly to our spouse. That we learn to live a God-centered, other-centered life by having good sex. In short, we learn the way of God. We learn the way of self-giving love through sex, which brings us to verse 4. Verse 4, the Apostle Paul is going to take this exact same direction. He says, the wife does not have authority over her own body, but yields it to her husband. And the same way, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but yields it to his wife. Now, I just want to be clear. If one of you were to go out and post on Facebook right now or something, the wife does not have authority over her own body, you would die. It would be bad. Wouldn't do that. Everyone will assume like you're like a monster, Ku Klux Klan member, kick small puppies. So admittedly, the idea of yielding authority over your body to someone else is a horrifically dangerous thing to do. No one can hurt you more than the person you give yourself to. Wholly. It can and has been used to abuse people in the past. If you give up authority over your own body, someone can completely and utterly destroy you. And this, of course, is why God says you only do it, only do this. Only give yourself entirely and completely in the confines of marital love, in the covenant of unconditional love, of unconditional acceptance, of unconditional commitment. Those are the only bonds that are strong enough to make that safe. So, in the scriptures, let's unpack this for a minute. In the scriptures, it's going to give us a picture of marital covenant. Where is it safe to do what Paul's talking about here? And he's going to say it's in marriage, because marriage in the scriptures is fundamentally a covenant and not a contract. It's a covenant. So it's a contract says, I'll do this for you if you do this for me. And if it doesn't work out, we'll break the contract, right? It's like a promise. But a covenant, this marital covenant, is not that. It's an exchange of persons. I am yours, and you are mine. Everything I have, everything I am is yours. And everything you have and everything you are is mine. Do you see the difference? It's completely and utterly different. So if you're sitting there saying, are you saying that my spouse owns me? Like they possess me like some kind of slave? And the answer is maybe. I mean, that's part of the imagery here. So in Song of Solomon, after the lover looks over his beloved from head to toe and says, let me climb the palm tree, what'd she say to him? How does she respond to him? Not, you're a pervert, get away from me. You know what she says? Let's look. She says, well, first, she says, may the wine go straight to my beloved, flowing gently over his lips and teeth. I want you to get drunk on me. I belong to my beloved, and his desire is for me. I belong to my beloved, and his desire is for me. So I want you to hear this. Is this slavery? And the answer is, kinda. She belongs to him. But it is love that has enslaved her. She's a slave to love, and that's a different type of slavery, isn't it? You see, when you know to the depths of your soul that you are beloved by someone, that they cherish you, when you know to the depths of your soul that their desire is for you, not just that they want to consume you, but they want you because they love you, that they're for you, they're for your good. When you know that, belonging to someone is the best thing that can happen to you. So she gives up all of her rights, but not to become less, to become more. She gives up her very self so that she can find herself in him. Does that language sound familiar here? Two become one. The sum is more than the parts. She gives up her rights to get what she really wants. You know what she really wants? Union with him. Life with him forever. She never wants to be separated from him. She wants to be consumed by him, drunk by him. She wholly gives herself to him because she knows that she's beloved. And she knows that his desire is for her. He is for her. He is for her. That is beautiful. In marriage, God has designed us in such a way that the only way to fully have another person is to fully give yourself to that person. So in marriage, we're called to surrender, to yield our desires, our future, our life, our very selves to our spouse. That sex is supposed to be a sweet surrender, but it is a surrender, or a surrender, as I was about ready to say. So I want you to see this. Sex is a sweet surrender, just like a relationship with God is. Do you see this? You see this? Apostle Paul, he's been working this through for a long time. Ephesians 5, he says it explicitly. If you want to have God, you have to give up everything. You have to give everything. Everything you have, everything you are. You no longer belong to yourself. You belong to him. You are his. And this just sounds insane. This sounds dehumanizing unless you're in love. If you're in love, it makes perfect sense. You lose everything, but you get God. You give up yourself because you don't want yourself. You want union with him forever. You want to say, I'm my beloved's and he is mine. So, Marriage. The Apostle Paul in Ephesians 5 will clearly teach us, and Romans 7 as well, that marriage is a picture of this, that you can know that you are beloved by God, that He is for you, and because of that, you give yourself wholly to Him, and He gives Himself wholly to you, and you are united forever. That's what a picture is. Now, marriage, of course, is an imperfect picture, but that doesn't mean there's not still truth in that, even in the twistedness and brokenness of our marriages. So for us, when we go back to this passage, the shocking part is that the wife doesn't have authority over her body. We're giving up our own authority. I just want to point out one thing, just to be painfully clear here. What's shocking for us is giving up your authority, but in the ancient world, that was not the shocking part. The shocking part is that the Apostle Paul applies this equally to husbands and wives. You see that? The wife doesn't have authority, but neither does the husband. Neither does the husband. That Paul teaches that marriage is about mutual surrender. Both have to surrender. Both surrender their desires. Both lay down their lives for each other. Both give themselves up. Both. And I just want you to know, I don't know of any other place in all of ancient literature where you will see this. This is stunning. Before we move off this, 2 footnotes and then we'll jump ahead. I want you to hear me because this sounds like I'm giving up authority over my body, and you are. I am not saying, and the Apostle Paul is not saying, you have to let your spouse abuse you. This is not about demanding your rights. This is the fact that you have to surrender them. This teaching should not empower abuse. You should not be destroyed by your spouse. If you are in an abusive relationship right now, I would strongly recommend that you talk to me, one of the staff members, one of the leaders at our church, and we help you get help. Not that we can solve this, but we can walk alongside you in it. We can help you. We can point you in the right direction. Strongly recommend that. That's the first thing. The second thing that I am saying, and more importantly, the Apostle Paul is saying in this, is that for husbands and wives both, but wives especially, if you are withholding sex from your spouse as a form of punishment, if you refuse to ever have sex because you just don't feel like it, you are in sin. Husbands and wives, but especially husbands, if you refuse to trust your spouse with your sexual desires, if you're going to porn or an affair or anything else other than your spouse with your sexual desires, you are in sin. That's what that means. Verse 5, do not deprive. Literally, do not defraud. Don't rob them of this. Do not deprive each other, except perhaps by mutual consent for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer, then come together again so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. We used to talk about this in seminary. This is the passage that says you have 2 options, sex or prayer. Which do you choose? That's not exactly right? There are obviously, just to clear the air here, there are obviously times in marriage, seasons, where you're not going to be having sex all the time, right? Health, schedules, traveling, babies, on and on we could go. You might have to go without sex for a period of time, but the Apostle Paul is saying there's a couple rules here, a couple things you should follow, best practices. It should be by mutual consent. You shouldn't force it on the other one. And it should only be for a time. It should be temporary. I don't know what temporary means for you, but it should be temporary. It shouldn't be indefinite. I say this, and he's referring back to this one exception about when you could take a break from sex for prayer. He says, I say this exception as a concession and not as a command. And this is so important to those who are super spiritual and think that prayer and sex don't go together. His whole point of saying this is, they do. Great prayers and great sex, they go together. You can pray all you want and have sex all you want. There's no stopping you. In fact, if you read through the scriptures, you will find that having sex will not hinder your prayers, but you know what will? According to 1 Peter 3:7, mistreating your spouse, that will hinder your prayers. I wish that all of you were as I am. I wish everyone in the world was just celibate and happy and single. It would be so much easier. But then he goes and says, but each of you has your own gift from God. Like celibacy, he says, is a gift from God. And not many people have it. So here's the thing. It's a gift from God, and not many have received this gift. So here's the implication. No one should force you to be celibate. No one. All right. So how do we apply this? Like, what do we do with this? Does this just mean we have to have sex on demand all the time? What is this? We got to go do our duty. So I want to be careful here. The fact is, we are all different. Remember the thumbprint thing. Maybe similar patterns, but we're all broken in different ways. Marriage is two very different, very broken sinners coming together. So please, please hear me. I don't want you to get the idea that every single night of your life you should come home and be like, I want to climb that palm tree. And she should be like, blow north wind. Like, no, that's probably not normal for most people. Perfect sex does not exist in this world, except maybe in Tuscany. No theory there. I think it might actually exist there. Let me just say, though, because I know some of us feel like suffocated by this, right? Like, what do I do with my brokenness? And I do want to say, there is hope. There is redemption. Wounds can heal. People can change. Sex can be very good. God can take two very different, very broken people and not just make them holy. He can actually make them happy. He can do something beautiful in them. And so I want to give you, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to give you three things that I think just need to lead us into a conversation. The first is we need to deal with God first. I want you to see the basis of everything Paul's saying here. Saying, if you've never given yourself fully to God, like never experienced what it's like to fully surrender to someone, to Him, if you don't know that you are God's beloved and that He's for you, if you don't know that and you've never surrendered to that, then that's where you got to start. This starts with a relationship with God. We love because He first loved us. If you've never given your life to Christ, you need to do that. That's where hope begins. That's where hope for your soul and your body and your marriage and your life begins. He wants to rebuild you. The next thing is you need to deal with yourself. Family history, sexual history, abuse, addiction, bad experiences, past pain, wrong thinking, fear, physical ailments, whatever. We bring all of this with us into the marriage bed. If you've never actually dealt with your stuff on a deep level, can I just tell you something? It doesn't go away on its own. It festers. It comes out in crazy ways. And it ruins things later. You got to pull that stuff out. You got to deal with it. This is why we have a counselor in our office now. Like, you need to deal with this. You need to get counseling. You need to be in accountability. You need to work through things. You need to get set free. You need to change your thinking. You need to be renewed by Jesus Christ. You got to deal with God. You got to deal with yourself. And then you deal with your spouse. Can I just say, for the vast majority of us, great sex does not begin with references to palm trees. Great sex begins with the words, I am so sorry. Will you forgive me?